I believe the president is speaking right now. Can we take a live listen in there?
Save them, but this is now taken it to a level that I think, Lee, that nobody ever thought even possible. They thought this was, nobody would have the courage to do it. We have to have the courage to do it because we're making America great again. This is a big factor in making our country great. If you look at some of these cars, they didn't even work. They had computers all over the place trying to save a half an ounce of fuel. We have fuel for the next 500 to 1,000 years under our feet, and they're trying like hell to save a half an ounce of fuel. The whole thing is just crazy. Please, go ahead, please.
Mr. President, is climate cooperation with China no longer in America's interest? And could you please confirm that you're going to visit China the first week of April?
Yeah, I'll be visiting President Xi in April. Look forward to it. He's coming here later in the year, and I look very much forward to it. No, our relationship with China is very good right now, and this is, not relevant too much having to do with China, what we're announcing today. But no, my relationship with President Xi is very good. Yes.
Mr. President, following your meeting with Prime Minister Netanyahu yesterday, has your thinking changed at all as it relates to these negotiations with Iran or the timeline with Iran?
We have to make a deal, otherwise it's going to be very traumatic. Very traumatic. I don't want that to happen, but we have to make a deal. They should have made a deal the first time, and they got Midnight Hammer instead. And this will be very traumatic for Iran if they don't make a deal. Look, if they don't make a deal, then it'll be a different story. But we had a very good meeting yesterday with Bibi Netanyahu, and he understands. But it's ultimately up to me. If the deal isn't a very fair deal and a very good deal with Iran, then it's going to be, I think, a very difficult time for them in the back. I guess over the next month, something like that. Yeah, it shouldn't take, it should happen quickly. They should agree very quickly, yeah.
Mr. President, we might be heading into a partial government shutdown. When was the last time you spoke with Chuck Schumer, and do you still feel Democrats are negotiating in good faith?
Well, a week ago I spoke, but we have to protect our law enforcement. Actually, the Supreme Court gave a ruling, or one of the courts gave a very big ruling on masks, that you have the right to use them, for personal protection if you want. So I don't know how that interjects. They want our law enforcement to be totally vulnerable and put them in a lot of danger. They have some things that are really very hard to approve, frankly. As you know, it only...
All right.
In the basement of the American legal system, there are a few heavy stones that hold the whole building up. One of those stones was laid in 2009. It was a simple scientific statement about the air we breathe. On February 12, 2026, the executive branch didn't just move that stone. They tried to erase the fact that it ever existed. This isn't just a story about the environment. It is a story about how power is used to rewrite reality. If you value deep analysis of how our institutions are being reshaped, please consider subscribing to this channel and sharing your thoughts on the rule of law in the comments below. Let's play this clip.
You've been listening live to the president speaking right now. Let's bring in CBS News White House reporter Willie James Inman. Willie, I know you and I were both listening to this at the same time. You're also processing this news. But listen, the threat to the environment and to human health posed by greenhouse gases has so far received pretty broad scientific consensus. So just back up for a second here and explain where this came from, what the motivation of this announcement today is.
Yeah, that's right. Broad consensus amongst other nations around the world as well. But this president in particular has continued to blast climate change as a hoax, saying that things like windmills cost more money, that they're not good uses of government resources and funding. Now, today, this announcement in particular is focused on what's called the endangerment finding, the legal and scientific justification for the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, to regulate fossil fuel emissions coming from cars and trucks. The White House says that regulation, the Obama-era regulation, is unnecessary, that it costs consumers money, it makes cars more expensive. That's what the Trump administration is saying. They say that taking back this rule would mean that consumers would be able to purchase vehicles. They'll be more affordable to those consumers. So this is a significant step for this White House in a rollback of climate policy. We, of course, know that the president
We begin today with a fundamental question about how a democracy functions. We have to ask ourselves what happens when the government decides that facts are no longer a requirement for policy. For nearly 2 decades, the United States government operated under a specific legal and scientific mandate. That mandate was called the Endangerment finding. It was a formal determination by the Environmental Protection Agency that greenhouse gases threaten the health and welfare of the American people. It was the legal foundation for every major climate rule in this country. It was the anchor for fuel standards for your car and pollution limits for power plants. On February 12, 2026, that anchor was cut. In the Roosevelt Room of the White House, President Donald Trump and EPA Administrator Lee Zeldin announced the repeal of the Endangerment finding. They called it the single largest deregulatory action in the history of the United States. They framed it as a massive win for consumer choice and the American dream. But as an analyst of institutional standards, we have to look past the rhetoric at the mechanics of what just happened. We are looking at an executive branch that is systematically dismantling the scientific basis of its own authority. The administration is not just changing a policy, they are attempting to reverse a scientific consensus that has been affirmed by the Supreme Court and decades of research. This is the most serious development in the history of American administrative law. It signals a shift away from evidence-based governance toward a model where political will overrides institutional expertise. The consequences of this shift are not theoretical. They will be measured in the air our children breathe, the prices we pay at the pump, and the stability of our very climate. To understand how we got to this room on February 12th, we have to go back to 1999. That was when a group of environmental organizations first petitioned the EPA to regulate greenhouse gases. At the time, the government under George W. Bush refused. They argued they didn't have the authority. They said the Clean Air Act wasn't meant for global problems. That fight went all the way to the Supreme Court in a case called Massachusetts versus EPA. In 2007, the court ruled against the government. They said greenhouse gases are indeed air pollutants. They told the EPA that it had to make a scientific judgment. It had to decide if these gases were dangerous. In 2009, the Obama administration made that judgment. They looked at the science and said, yes, these gases endanger our health. That finding was not just a memo, it was a legal trigger. Once the endangerment was found, the law required the EPA to act. For 16 years, that finding stood. It was upheld by the courts multiple times. It survived every legal challenge because it was rooted in a mountain of scientific evidence.
The president has worked to roll back other major regulations, but this one is certainly significant with this announcement today, Chanel.
And Willie, I know you might not have all the answers right now because we're just watching this happen live at this point, but is there any scientific backing to rolling this back?
Well, this is certainly a policy initiative that the White House is saying. They're not saying that they're doing this because of a scientific process. They're saying they're simply doing this to roll it back to save consumers money, that somehow cars will be less expensive. The president oftentimes talks about the Green New Scam, referring to the Green New Deal, a major piece of legislation or a hope that Democrats had years ago that did not make its way through Congress. But this one, based off of a policy move today, the White House believes will save consumers money, Chanel.
And Willie James, I also want to ask you about another big piece of news. The Trump administration now working to sort of expand efforts to strip citizenship from people who were born in other countries but who are now American. So who are they targeting here, and will those efforts be successful?
Yeah, it's unclear at this point if they will ultimately be successful, but they have reportedly started sending out government agents or experts to field offices to review some of those applications with naturalized citizens. As you mentioned, those citizens born overseas, they went through the process to become American citizens. Specifically, the Trump administration is reportedly focused on people who committed fraud or misrepresentation. Now, these cases are rare to revoke citizenship from naturalized citizens here in the United States, but the Trump administration making this effort as part of the immigration crackdown that the president has signaled that he wants DHS and other agencies within the government to carry out.
Okay, Willie James Inman live for us with this breaking news. Thank you.
But the new administration has a different view of the law. Lee Zeldin, the EPA administrator, referred to the endangerment finding as the holy grail of a climate change religion. The administration argues that the EPA exceeded its authority. They claim the Clean Air Act was only meant for local and regional pollution. They are using a legal theory called the Major Questions Doctrine. This doctrine says that if a policy is major and has a huge economic impact, the agency can't act unless Congress gives it very specific permission. This is where we see the first major tension in our institutional standards. The Supreme Court already ruled in 2007 that the EPA has this authority, but the current administration is betting that the current Supreme Court, which is much more conservative, will overturn that precedent. This is a direct challenge to the concept of stare decisis, or following previous court rulings. It suggests that the legal foundation of our country is now subject to the changing winds of whichever party holds the White House. The administration's justification for this move relies heavily on a new report from the Department of Energy. This report was authored by 5 scientists handpicked by Energy Secretary Chris Wright. These scientists are often described as climate minimizers. They don't necessarily deny that the climate is changing, but they claim the dangers are much smaller than we thought. They argue that even if the U.S. eliminated all vehicle emissions, it wouldn't change global climate indicators by the year 2100. However, the way this report was created has raised serious red flags about transparency and democratic norms. Environmental groups have already filed a lawsuit in Massachusetts. They allege the administration violated the Federal Advisory Committee Act. This is a Nixon-era law that requires government committees to have balanced viewpoints and hold public meetings. The lawsuit claims the Climate Working Group was created in secret. It says the public didn't even know it existed until the report was finished. This group didn't include a single scientist who agrees with the global consensus on climate change. When a government creates its own secret science to justify overturning 16 years of established law, it undermines public trust in our institutions. It suggests that the data is being made to fit the policy rather than the policy being made to fit the data. This is what critics are calling a war on science. It includes removing climate data from government websites and firing scientists from research programs. It even involves restricting federal agencies from using terms like green or emissions. This isn't just a policy change, it is an attempt to control the very language of the debate. Let's look at the documented consequences of this decision. The administration claims this repeal will save Americans $1.3 trillion. They say it will lower the cost of a new car by about $2,400. They argue this will restore the American dream by making vehicles more affordable for families. But other analysts tell a very different story based on economic modeling. An analysis by Energy Innovation suggests that repealing these standards will actually increase costs for American households. Why? Because it will slow down the transition to more efficient electric vehicles. That means Americans will be forced to buy more gasoline. The model predicts that gasoline prices will rise because of this increased demand. They estimate that by 2043, the average household could be spending $400 more per year on gas. Over the next 25 years, that adds up to $310 billion in higher energy bills across the country. Then there is the impact on jobs. The administration says deregulation helps small businesses and the economy, but the data shows that investment in clean energy and electric vehicles was a massive driver of growth. Between 2020 and 2025, investment in zero-emission vehicle manufacturing increased 15 times over. By cutting these standards, the U.S. risks losing its competitive edge in the global market. The modeling predicts a loss of about 110,000 jobs per year on average through 2050. Manufacturing jobs are expected to hit the hardest, with a peak loss of 175,000 jobs around the year 2039. But perhaps the most urgent consequence is the impact on public health. The endangerment finding was built on the idea that pollution harms people. When you repeal the standards that limit tailpipe emissions, you get more pollution in the air. We aren't just talking about carbon dioxide. We are talking about particulate matter, nitrogen oxides, and sulfur oxides. These are pollutants that accumulate near roadways where people live and children play. The data suggests this repeal will lead to 700 premature deaths every single year. These deaths are linked to increased rates of asthma, heart attacks, and bronchitis. Children and the elderly are the most vulnerable. In California alone, the state government points to the lived reality of its people. Wildfires fueled by rising temperatures have already killed hundreds and destroyed tens of thousands of homes. Extreme heat is now the deadliest climate impact in the country. By dismissing the science that protected public health for decades, the EPA is essentially telling these victims to ignore the flames and the rising water. This brings us to a critical point about federalism and the role of the states. California has always been a leader in environmental standards. For decades, the EPA has granted California a waiver to set its own stricter rules. Other states, representing about 40% of the U.S. car market, then follow California's lead. This California waiver is a key part of how our system of state and federal power is supposed to work. But the administration is also moving to block these waivers. They want a single federal standard that is much weaker than what the states want. Governor Gavin Newsom has vowed to sue the administration to challenge the repeal of the endangerment finding. He called the decision reckless and a betrayal of the American people. He argues that California has proven you can grow an economy while cutting pollution. Since 2000, California's greenhouse gas emissions are down 21%, while its economy has grown by 81%. It is now the fourth largest economy in the world. This creates a massive legal and economic tangle. Car manufacturers now face years of uncertainty. They have to decide what kinds of cars to build years in advance. Should they build the gas guzzlers the Trump administration wants, or the electric cars the global market and states like California are demanding? This regulatory chaos led companies to cancel tens of billions of dollars in clean energy investments in 2025 alone. And while the U.S. pulls back, the rest of the world is moving forward. The Trump administration has withdrawn from the Paris Agreement for a second time. They have also pulled out of 65 international organizations, including the United Nations Framework on Climate. This surrenders American leadership on the world stage. It cedes the economic ground of the future to countries like China, which are continuing to invest heavily in new technologies. Now, we have to talk about what happens next in the courts. This repeal is not the end of the story. It is the beginning of a long legal war. The EPA must follow specific procedures under the Clean Air Act to change its rules. They have to take public comments and respond to every significant criticism. During the comment period for this repeal, the EPA received over 570,000 comments. If they don't respond to them with meticulous detail, the courts could throw out the whole repeal. The lawsuits will likely be filed in the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals. That process usually takes about a year. Then it will almost certainly go to the Supreme Court. We are looking at a timeline that stretches into 2027 or 2028, which is another election year. This means that for the next several years, the law of the land on climate change will be a giant question mark. There are several ways the Supreme Court could rule. They could uphold the repeal, effectively agreeing with the administration's 5 scientists. This would be a major shift in how the court views agency expertise. Historically, courts have given agencies a zone of reasonableness when it comes to facts. If the court starts second-guessing the science itself, it fundamentally changes the nature of administrative law. The worst-case scenario for climate advocates is that the Supreme Court uses this case to overrule Massachusetts versus EPA entirely. They could find that the Clean Air Act never gave the EPA the power to regulate greenhouse gases at all. This would prevent any future administration from ever using this law to fight climate change without a new act of Congress. Given that the 5 justices who voted for the 2007 ruling are all gone and the dissenters are still on the court, this is a very real possibility. However, there is an interesting twist in the legal history here. In the past, the Supreme Court said that people couldn't sue fossil fuel companies under federal common law because the Clean Air Act already covered the problem. They said the EPA had the authority, so the court shouldn't interfere. But if the EPA no longer has that authority, that argument goes away. We might see a massive wave of new lawsuits in federal court against oil and gas companies because there is no longer a federal regulation in place. The very industry that wanted this repeal might find itself facing even more dangerous legal threats from states and cities. This brings us back to the core of our institutional analysis. We are seeing a breakdown of the norms that have governed our country for decades. Usually, when a government changes a major scientific finding, it does so based on new, overwhelming evidence. But here, the administration is doing it based on a secret working group and 5 hand-picked scientists. They are ignoring the 85 independent scientists who published a 400-page takedown of their energy report. When an administration sides with polluters over people, as the chair of the California Air Resources Board put it, it abandons the future of the country. It tells the parents of asthmatic children to ignore the dirty air. It tells the victims of floods and wildfires that their lived reality doesn't matter. This isn't just a policy debate about the economy versus the environment. It is a debate about whether our government is still committed to protecting the public health and welfare as the law requires. The Clean Air Act states that the EPA administrator shall issue standards for air pollutants that may reasonably be anticipated to endanger public health or welfare. The word shall is a command. It doesn't say may if it's convenient or may if it doesn't cost too much. It is a mandate to protect the people. By repealing the finding that triggers this mandate, the administration is attempting to walk away from its most basic responsibility. We are watching a high-stakes experiment in executive power. The administration is testing whether it can use the Major Questions Doctrine and minimizer science to rewrite the rules of American life. They are betting that the judiciary will support this expansion of political will over scientific fact. But the real-world consequences will not wait for the courts. The wildfires will continue to burn, the seas will continue to rise, and the American people will be left to foot the bill, both in their energy costs and in their health. The repeal of the endangerment finding is not just a line in a law book, it is a decision that will shape the American landscape for generations to come. As this legal battle moves into the D.C. Circuit and then to the Supreme Court, we have to keep our eyes on the mechanics of power. We have to ask who is being served by these decisions. Is it the hardworking families the administration talks about? Or is it the billionaire polluters who are seeing their regulatory burdens disappear? The state of California has already made its choice. They will continue to lead because they believe the lives of their people depend on it. Other states are joining them. This creates a fractured America, where your right to breathe clean air depends on which state line you are standing behind. This is the state of our democracy in 2026. It is a system where the very definition of endangerment is now a political choice. It is a system where the scientific consensus of the world can be set aside by a single meeting in the Roosevelt Room. We will be following every step of the lawsuits and the procedural moves by the EPA, because in a country ruled by law, the facts are supposed to be the one thing we can all agree on. When the government stops believing in facts, it is up to the other institutions, the courts, the states, and the public to hold the line. Thank you for joining this analysis of U.S. political power and our changing institutional standards. The repeal of the endangerment finding is a massive shift in the American story. It is a story we are all living through right now. We will keep digging into the data and the legal filings to bring you the truth behind the headlines, because in the end, the air we breathe doesn't care about politics. It only cares about the molecules we put into it, and the laws we write today will determine what those molecules are for the next 100 years. I am your independent analyst, and this is the reality of the deregulatory push in 2026. The foundation has been moved. Now we have to see if the building stays standing. Keep asking the hard questions, keep looking at the data, and keep an eye on the Roosevelt Room, because what happens there affects every single one of us. Good night.